Good afternoon, everyone. It's time for Mrs. Ballou Reads on this beautiful fall day. And this week we're starting a new book, Poppy by Avi. And this book was published by Orchard Books. Poppy by Avi. Here's where it takes place. Chapter 1, Mr. O'Cox. A thin crescent moon high in the sky shed faint light over dim wood forests. Stars glowed, breezes full of ripe summer fragrance floated over nearby meadow and hill. Dim wood itself, veiled in darkness, lay utterly still. At the very edge of this forest stood an old charred oak on which sat a great horned owl. The owl's name was Mr. O'Cox, and he looked by death himself. Mr. O'Cox's eyes, flat upon his face, were round and yellow with large amity pupils that enabled him to see as few other creatures could. Moonlight, even faint moonlight, was as good as daylight for him. With his piercing gaze, Mr. O'Cox surveyed the lands he called his own, watching for the comings and goings of the creatures he considered his subjects and his dinners. He looked at Glitter Creek, home to the fish he found so appetizing, the tar road across which tasty rabbits were known to hop, Jayswood, where meaty chipmunks sometimes skittered before dawn. By swiveling his head, he searched the marsh for a savory frog, then Newfield, where usually he could count on a delicious bowl or two. He looked at Grey House, where Farmer Lamont used to live, then upon the old orchard. He even looked nervously toward New House. But nowhere did he see a thing to eat. Profoundly annoyed, Mr. O'Cox was beginning to think he would have no dinner that night. But finally, there, near the top of Bannock Hill, where the ponderosa pines had all been cut, where only a few struggling saplings and bushes grew, he saw movement. Just the glimmer of food was enough to cause his owl's heart to pound, his curved black beak to clack, his feathered horns to stand up tall. Mr. O'Cox shifted his head from right to left, forward and back. When he did so, he beheld 2 mice. Of all the creatures the owl hunted, he enjoyed mice the most. They were the best eating, to be sure, but better still, they were the most fearful, and Mr. O'Cox found deep satisfaction in having others afraid of him. And here, after a wait of nearly the whole night, were 2 savory subjects to terrify before he ate them. One of the 2, a deer mouse, crouched cautiously beneath a length of rotten bark. The other, a golden mouse, stood in the open on his hind legs, his short tail sticking straight out behind for balance. From his left ear an earring dangled. In his paws he held a hazelnut. "It's not as if I haven't warned these mice," Mr. O'Cox murmured to himself. "If they will move about without my permission, they have only themselves to blame for the consequences." As he leaned forward to listen, his sharp as needles talons, 4 to each large claw, and jet black at their tips, cut deeply into the branch he was perched on. "Catching these 2 mice," he mused, "is going to be fun." On Bannock Hill, the golden mouse turned to his timid companion and said, "Poppy girl, this hazelnut is bad to the bone. Bet you see the sap there's more where it came from. Come on out and dig." "Ragweed," Poppy replied as she sniffed tensely in all directions. "You promised we'd dance when we got here. We can't do it in the open. Besides, I want to answer your question. So you'll please get under here with me?" There they are. Ragweed laughed. "Dude, you must think I'm as dull as a dormouse. You just want to get some of this nut." "I don't want any of your precious nut," Poppy insisted. "I want to give you my answer, and I want to dance. Isn't that the reason we came up the hill? Only it's not safe out there." "Oh, tell me about it." "You heard my father's warnings," Poppy went on. "It's Mr. O'Cox. He might be watching and listening." "Get off!" Ragweed sneered. "Your pop talks about that O'Cox dude just to scare you and keep you under control." "Ragweed," Poppy cried, "that's ridiculous. Mr. O'Cox does rule Linwood, so we have to ask his permission to be here, and you know perfectly well that we never did." "Dude, I'm not going to spend my life asking an old owl's okay every time I want to have fun. Know what I'm saying? This is our moment, girl, right? And now that I've dug this nut up, I'm going to enjoy it. Besides, it's too dark for an old owl to see me. Poppy, Mr. Wilcox scoffed under his breath. Ragweed, what stupid names mice have. Now, if only that deer mouse would move just a little farther out from under cover, I'd be able to snare both mice at once. The mere thought of such a double catch made Mr. Wilcox hiss with pleasure. Then he clacked his beak, spread his wings, and rose into the night air. Up he circled, his fluted fight feathers beating the air silently. High above Bannock Hill he looked down. The golden mouse, the one eating the nut, was still in the open, so brazen, so foolish. Nevertheless, Mr. Wilcox decided to hold back another moment to see if the deer mouse might budge. Ragweed, Poppy pleaded, please come under here. Girl, Ragweed said, do you know what your problem is? You let your tail lead the way. Poppy, hurt and wanted to show she was not a coward, poked her nose and whiskers out from under the bark. Ragweed, she persisted, even as she began to creep out in the open. Being careless is stupid. Her friend took another scrape of the nut and sighed with pleasure. Poppy, you may be my best girl, but admit it, you don't know how to live like I do. Poppy took 2 more steps beyond the bark. Just then, Mr. Wilcox pulled his wings close to his body and plunged. In an instant, he was right above and behind the 2 mice. Once there, he threw out his wings to break his speed, pulled back his head to protect his eyes, and thrust his claws forward and wide like grappling hooks to pounce. It was Poppy who saw him. Ragweed, she shrieked in terror. She hurled herself back under cover. It's Wilcox! But the owl was already upon them. Down came his right claw. It scratched the tip of Poppy's nose. Down came his left claw. It was much more successful, clamping around Ragweed's head and neck like a vice of needles, killing him instantly. The next moment, the owl soared back into the air. A lifeless Ragweed, earring glittering in the moonlight, hung from a claw. As for the hazelnut, it fell to the earth like a cold stone. Powerful but leisurely strokes brought Mr. Wilcox back to his watching tree. Once there, he shifted the dead Ragweed from talon to beak in one gulp. The mouse disappeared down his throat, earring and all. His hunger momentarily satisfied, Mr. Wilcox tilted back his head and let forth a long, low cry of triumph. Whoo! Whoo! Poppy did not hear the call. In her terror, she had fainted. Now she lay unconscious beneath the length of rotten bark. The owl did not mind. He had enjoyed the first mouse so much, he decided to wait for the second. Indeed, Mr. Wilcox was not entirely sorry that Poppy had escaped. She was terrified, and he enjoyed that. And for sure he would get her soon. Oh, yes, he murmured to himself, mice are the most fun to catch. Then Mr. Wilcox did the rare thing for an owl. He smiled. Chapter 2, Poppy Remembers. A stinging sensation on her nose woke Poppy. She touched a paw to the sore spot and winced. Then she looked about in the dark and shook her head with confusion. Where was she? Under a piece of rotten bark. Where was the bark? On Bannock Hill. What was she doing there? She had come with her boyfriend, Ragweed. Where was Ragweed? No sooner did Poppy ask herself that than the full horror of what had occurred rushed upon her. Ragweed dead. Eaten, probably. Poppy closed her eyes. The sheer ghastliness of the thought made it hard for her to breathe. Then, recalling how close she had come to the same fate, she checked herself for other injuries. Though her plump, round belly was white, the rest of her fur was orange-brown. She had large ears and dark, almost round eyes, full whiskers, tiny nose, pink toes, and tail. Even for a deer mouse, Poppy was rather dainty. Upon examination, everything except the nose seemed to be intact. She stole a look out from under the bark and considered her situation. She was on Bannock Hill alone and without permission. Oh, how she wished she were home. From her earliest days, just a few full moments ago, her parents had been teaching their litter about Mr. Wilcox. She recalled how they had lined up all 12 of them to take instruction. Mr. Wilcox has been about for ages, her father, Lungwort, lectured in his sternest voice. He was a rather stout fellow with elegantly curled whiskers and slightly protruding front teeth. His crowning glory was an ivory thimble he had found, and which ever since he'd worn as a cap. Mr. O'Cock's been here longer than any mouse's living memory, Longwort continued. The territory around Dimwood belongs to him. Mr. O'Cock's is king. And he protects us, said sweet Cicely, Longwort's wife and Poppy's mother. That's the most important thing. Sweet Cicely was a small creature, even for a deer mouse, with soft, pale eyes and a nervous habit of flicking at her ears with her paws as if they were dusty. Protects us from what? Poppy remembered Ragweed asking. An outsider he had taken to hang around the family. He was always asking for answers. Why do deer mice live here and not there? Why do you folks eat this and not that? Why is your fur dark on top and white on the bottom when mine is golden? Why couldn't it be the other way around? Though these constant questions could be irritating, Poppy had to admit that she had often wondered about the answers. Curiosity, however, was not something her parents encouraged. Poppy admired Ragweed's persistence. Mr. O'Cock's protects us from creatures that eat us, Longwort answered gravely. Raccoons, foxes, skunks, weasels, stoats. One by one, he displayed pictures of these animals. Most important, he protects us from porcupines, like this one. He held up a lurid portrait of a huge black-nosed beast covered with gruesome spikes. Blood seemed to drip from his snarling mouth. The young mice gasped in dread. Porcupines are our particular enemies, Longwort insisted. There's nothing porcupines won't do to catch mice. What would they do with us then? Acorn, one of Poppy's sisters, asked in a trembling voice. First they shoot their barbed quills into you, Longwort said. Then they trample you, sweet Cicely added. Finally, Longwort concluded, they break you into little bits and gobble you up. Now it was terror that the young mice felt, all except Ragweed. Longwort, he demanded, other than that picture, you ever seen a porcupine? A real one? There he is showing the picture to the young mice. Not precisely, Longwort snapped, but let me tell you something, Ragweed. I'd be more than thrilled to get through my whole life without ever seeing one. After all, Mr. O'Cock has seen porcupines. Often, in private conversations with me, mind, these are actual personal experiences I can verify, he informed me that porcupines are not only extremely dangerous, but also devilishly sly. Take note that this judgment comes from a powerful meat-eating bird. The point is, Mr. O'Cock protects us from porcupines. It was he, in fact, who was kind enough to educate us about them as well as supply these pictures. Then how come you have to worry about this dude O'Cock's too? Ragweed pressed. Struggling to control his temper, Longwort tapped his thimble cap down over his forehead. Fuming, he replied. Mr. O'Cock protects us from vicious porcupines only when we accept him as our ruler. That's why. All he requires is that we ask his permission whenever we move beyond the immediate area of Grey House. We have the freedom to go about the old orchard up to Glitter Creek. We can do the same for Farmer Lamott's fields, at our own risk, of course. Life is full of danger. Go beyond, however, and we need to get Mr. O'Cock's permission. What's his reason? Ragweed persevered. Sweet Cicely, brushing her ears, sighed with exasperation. How Poppy, her own daughter, could take up with such an ill-mannered ruffian was beyond her understanding. All the same, she said, Ragweed, as Mr. O'Cock has patiently explained to my husband, he needs to know if we are moving about so he won't mistake us for porcupines. Asking permission is a small sacrifice to pay for our safety. Longwort nodded his agreement. That owl, he pointed out, has incredible vision and hearing. He can hear or see anything, even in the dark. And a good thing, too. Porcupines prowl at night. Move like lightning, Mr. O'Cock says. Shoot quills without asking questions. Kill without mercy. No, my boy, we don't argue with Mr. O'Cock. He's our protector. If I disobey him, break his rules, and I can't say I blame him either, he gets upset. What'll he do then? Asked Leaf, one of Poppy's brothers. He'll eat you, Longwort replied briskly as he put away the picture of the porcupine. And, he continued, it happens. During the past year, we have lost 15 family members. It may be presumed that all failed to ask Mr. O'Cock for permission to go somewhere. The children were shocked into silence. Ragweed, however, spoke out again. Hey, Pops, didn't I hear you say porcupines are huge? You saw the picture, Longwort responded. And don't call me Pops. It's common. So then porcupines are bigger than us, right? A lot bigger, Sweet Cicely said, emphasizing the lot. Well, old lady, Ragweed kept on. If them there porcupines are so huge and we're so small, and if this dude owl has such amazing sight, how come he might confuse us mice with them there dude porcupines? Know what I'm saying? An indignant, sweet Cicely looked to her husband. Lugwort sputtered. Ragweed, for your information, proper grammatical usage is those porcupines, not them there porcupines. And while I'm thinking about it, if you intend to court my daughter, I'll thank you to groom your hair properly when you get up in the morning. As for that earring you've taken to wearing, I don't like it. Not one bit. The family is committed to keeping up mice values and is opposed to stupid questions. With that, Legwort stalked away, tail whipping about in agitation. On Bannock Hill, Poppy remembered it all. She also remembered it was Ragweed who had insisted they come up the hill, but that he absolutely refused to ask Mr. Wilcox's permission to do so. Perhaps then what had occurred, horrible as it had been, had served Ragweed right. Then and there Poppy vowed she would never leave home again. The difficulty was that at that moment she was far from home, frightened and alone. Chapter 3, Poppy, Alone. Poppy glanced to the east. The horizon was streaked with layers of pink and red. Did that make it night or day? Neither. It was impossible to guess then if the owl was still awake as he was at night, or asleep as he was by day. Besides, the place in Dimwood Forest where Mr. Wilcox slept, not the same as his watching post, was unknown. He kept it secret. As if she might discover it, Poppy gazed into the forest. All she could make out was a great mass of dark trees. No wonder it was called dim, she thought, and shuddered. Poppy considered the distance from the north side of Bannock Hill, where she was hiding, to the dwelling on the abandoned farm where she and her family lived, Grey House. It was about the length of 4 cornfields. Poppy decided she best race from one protected spot to another in quick, low belly runs. She peeked out from beneath the bark again. There was a fallen branch up ahead, but it was leafless, so it would provide no cover. Beyond the branch, however, she spied a rock with a crevice just large enough to wedge into. Poppy decided to aim for that. Whiskers stiffly alert, breathing deeply to catch the smallest whiff of danger, she crept out from under the protected piece of bark. If only, she kept saying to herself, if only Mr. Wilcox was not watching. But Mr. Wilcox was watching. He was perched perfectly still on a dead branch of his tree with a very wide-open eyes. Not for a moment had he ceased staring at Poppy's hiding place. There was one thing the owl hated more than a creature who neglected to ask permission to move about the territory. It was a creature who escaped punishment for not asking. How could he keep the mice terrified if any one of them got away with that? No, this Poppy must not escape. Mr. Wilcox belched, bringing up a pellet of Ragweed's bones and fur, as well as the earring, which he had been unable to digest. The pellet fell to the ground to lie among a large pile of other pellets. Intently, the owl moved his head from side to side, back to forth and forth, adjusting his depth of vision. In time, he saw Poppy's pink nose poke out from her hiding place. Then he watched as she raced toward a rock. At last, the mouse was on the move. Mr. Wilcox clacked his beak with pleasure, spread his wings, and leaped into the sky. Panting hard, but protected by the crevice, Poppy squirmed about and sniffed for hints of danger. She found none. Once she had caught her breath, she edged a bit out of her nook and studied the terrain. The nearest haven she could see was a bush whose partly exposed roots straddled a hole big enough to shelter her. Unfortunately, the bush was on the far side of a flat, open space, a long way from where she crouched, was farther by far than the length of Grey House's attic, farther even than the water pump beyond the back door, farther, in fact, than Poppy had ever run without stopping to rest. She sighed with dismay. Then she looked again. This time she spied a rectangular strip of wood propped against a stone at an upward angle. It was about halfway between where she hunched and the hole. Poppy told herself that if she tired, or if some danger appeared, she would be able to hide, briefly, beneath the high end. Tense, she examined the eastern sky once more. It had grown lighter. Was it day yet? Would Mr. Wilcox be asleep now? The owl, cruising high to the west of Bannock Hill, moved his wings slowly, wanting to make the least possible disturbance on the air. These deer mice, he knew, could be very sensitive. As he flew, he kept his eyes fixed on Poppy's rock. The mouse's run suggested what she was doing, moving from protected spot to protected spot. Mr. Wilcox was well aware that the biggest family of deer mice in his territory, headed by that old fool Lungwort, lived in Gray House. More than likely this Poppy was heading there. Well then, how would she go? The owl spied a bush on the south side of the hill. Though it was some distance from the rock, it would be a logical next hiding place for the mouse. But if it came to a race for that bush, he knew who would win. Mr. O'Cox gave a hiss of satisfaction. Poppy cleared the rock crevice in one jump. Her landing, however, was awkward. It threw up a puff of dust. Swiftly, she scrambled back to her feet, then started to dash across the open area. Belly low, tail stiff as a nail, ears folded back, she pumped her legs like pistons. Mr. O'Cox, circling above, saw the dust caused by the mouse's jump. The next moment he spotted Poppy. In a flash, he calculated her speed and direction. Determining the exact spot where he could catch her, he made 4 quick, strong wing pumps, which brought him to the proper altitude. Then he dived. Poppy streaked over the ground. Though she felt as though her heart would burst, she was almost halfway to the bush. Soon she would be passing the wood strip. Mr. O'Cox, who had plummeted to the spot not far above and behind Poppy, threw out his wings, pulled back his head, thrust his claws forward. In anticipation of the meal he was about to eat, he clacked his beak. Poppy, hearing the clack, cast a lightning glance over her shoulder. Mr. O'Cox was right behind her, his fearsome talons set. The shock of seeing the owl so close surged through her like a bolt of electricity. With an enormous kick of her rear legs, she shot into the air, tumbling head over heels until she came down, belly flat, on the far end of the length of wood. Poppy's leap caught Mr. O'Cox by surprise. As he dived, Poppy took off. Sensing he would miss her, he adjusted. Up came his claws, down came his left wing, over went his tail. What Mr. O'Cox achieved, however, was a careening swerve that brought him crashing beyond his target, onto the same strip of wood as Poppy, but on the opposite end. When Mr. O'Cox landed, his weight catapulted the light as a feather mouse into the air in a great arc that dumped her with a splat right at the base of the bush. Frantic, she crawled forward and tumbled head over heels into the hole she'd been aiming for. Mr. O'Cox swiveled his head first this way, then that, searching for his prey. She seemed to have vanished. Frustrated, he flapped into the air and circled low over Bannock Hill, but found no trace. Seething, the owl headed back to Dimwood. How dare this mouse, this Poppy, escape twice? Never had a mouse done that. Mr. O'Cox had half a mind to return to his watching tree and wait for the impotent creature to pop up. The next moment he decided against it. He was tired. Daylight had finally arrived. It was long past his sleeping time. Besides, he had eaten something. But as Mr. O'Cox sailed deep into Dimwood toward his secret lair, he vowed to avenge himself. Mice began to get notions that they could escape him. There would be no end of trouble. Poppy lay in the hole beneath the bush, hurting from ears to tail. It took time for her breathing to become regular, longer still for her pulse to drop to normal. When she began to feel herself again, she tested her legs and toes to see if they worked. Everything seemed to be intact. Cautiously, she crawled to the top of the hole and stole a quick peek. Though she saw no sign of Mr. O'Cox, she retreated hastily, still too agitated to do anything but hide. It was some time before Poppy took another look. Then she took a third. Though she still didn't see the owl, she hesitated. Mr. O'Cox, she knew, was capable of great patience. So it was that the sun had risen quite high above the horizon before Poppy finally eased herself out of the hole. Following her plan of short runs and safe havens, she scampered at last down Bannock Hill to Gray House. According to Mice family stories, a human called Farmer Lamont had lived in the house. When he and his family left, it was said to be many, many winters ago, the house had started to collapse. The white walls turned ashen, the roof's middle dropped lower than either end, windows fell out, doors fell in. The farmer's cast-off boots, old furniture, magazines crumbled. All in all, it was a perfect and safe home for Poppy's family. But as Poppy approached the house, she spied a small red flag hanging from one end of the roof. She stopped short. A red flag was her father's signal that the entire clan needed to gather for an emergency meeting. Poppy's first thought was that news of Ragweed's death had already reached home. Then she realized how unlikely that was. Something else of grave importance must have occurred. This is the house that they live in. So that's the first 3 chapters of Poppy by Avi. We'll read some more chapters next Wednesday. I hope you enjoy hearing about Poppy and her adventures and what's that emergency meeting going to be all about. Enjoy the rest of your day. Bye.